up to there were a lot of findings which suggest that youth programs weren't very effective. But actually, now that evaluations, impact evaluations, are beginning to be undertaken distance of time from the intervention itself, a longer distance of time, we're finding that youth interventions are more effective than there was previously thought. You need some time after the end of the intervention for the impact to come through. Finally on that general area, it's very common in lower income countries to have programs which encourage youth entrepreneurship. This is largely, I think, a question of what is feasible to do rather than what is best for the country. I don't think youth entrepreneurship programs are going to solve anybody's youth unemployment problems. They are useful for a small group of people who are adapted to become entrepreneurs, but that is certainly not the majority of the youth population. So in my concluding remarks, I'd just like to say that youth unemployment or non-employment is a serious problem, also low-quality employment, primarily because of its longer-term consequences. This is what patterns established early on in life are going to persist through life, and there's absolutely no doubt about that. That is why it's a real problem and a real issue to deal with. The main problem is inadequate aggregate demand, but institutions matter, but we need much more work on understanding how institutions matter and how they interact with each other. Really is the key point from my point of view. That is, why do certain programs work, certain institutions useful in certain contexts? I think it goes back to what the dynamic fellow this morning was saying about we need to know more about how. Yeah, this is precisely, we need to know why certain institutions affect youth unemployment and in what conditions. Again, the most effective approach involves protected entry, dual apprenticeship system, but this requires a series of conditions. And finally, active labour market programs vary greatly in their effectiveness according to context, according to a series of factors. But what has emerged in now we get more and more impact studies. What has happened with the emergence of these new impact studies is that we have cast doubt on the early findings. There's more and more variety in results, and so it brings back to the point that what works depends on the context, depends on the other institutions operating in the labour market and so on. This needs to be understood much better. With that, I'll finish. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Neil. Yes, I took away sort of two key messages from that presentation. So there is the issue of scarring for youth. So keeping youth, if they remain for a long time either unemployed or stuck in low-paid, precarious jobs, that can have long-term consequences, both in terms of their health and for society as a whole. And then the interactions of policies is really important as well. One policy in isolation may either have a good or positive impact, but you have to look at the combination of policies, and that can have a very different impact on youth employment prospects. Let me call upon straight away, who will be starting? So let me call upon Chair Varick to give us a presentation. I think this one will be concentrating a little bit more and in-depth on the situation facing young people in India in particular.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Mark, and thank you to ICRIER for asking Arup and myself to present this paper. It's a paper we did quite a long time ago, so I think they picked up on that paper and asked both of us to speak, rather in an orthodox fashion, but we're very happy to be here. A lot has already been said with the chair and the two presenters, so I don't want to labour all those points again. But I want to point out there is a lot of common ground on some of these issues. I think it's an area that a lot of people that have got around, and international organisations, OECD, the ILO, European Commission, World Bank, etc., have devoted a lot of attention. And we see that in the way we will describe the issues. I mean, it's one area where there's a lot more common ground than many other labour issues. So I don't think it's why it's often you'll see that we'll end up talking pretty much about the same issues from the same angle. But I really also want to stress that the relevance of that global European perspective on youth employment and unemployment. And a lot of that has already been also touched on, but I think what is critical is that we think about, responding to that challenge in these regions. We'll describe the problem, and Arup will go into further detail into the situation in India, but I think what would be very interesting also for me personally is to hear from the audience about tackling the problem in these countries, because it's not a simple story of whether we're just going to intervene with active labour market policies or not, etc. I'll come to that. So I wanted to talk about why we should be concerned. We've already heard a lot about this, something very briefly on global trends, situation in South Asia, before coming to this issue about the policy response. Again, I'm repeating ad nauseum for what's been said since this morning. We all know what is the situation. But I think you also know the critical role the demographic dividend has played in development. It's been associated with the successfully developing countries, also in East Asia. We also know the precariousness or the vulnerability of youth in the labour market. We've heard that well discussed, and I would of course also fully support the notion that we're not just worried about unemployment, and in fact looking narrowly at unemployment in countries like India can be very misleading, though there is some value in that information, and we'll see that in the Indian case. People are unemployed, but then we'll see that they are urban, but urban youth and particularly young women. And that has something not just to do with the demand side, but often to do with preferences and their opportunities for working outside. The NEET has already been mentioned, and I think it is very important to mention, and I fully support that. But I would also say in the Indian case, the NEET figure is very much influenced by women. You all be aware that female labour force participation, as was mentioned this morning, is very low in India, throughout South Asia except for Nepal, and of course that drives that inactivity rate. We've heard a lot about the skills issue. The issue about job search, of course, is a major challenge. This issue about precariousness over the business cycle, and I think what is fair is that youth are more likely to become unemployed earlier in a downturn, but adults are catching up over the longer term. But then, of course, there's this overall issue of withdrawing from the labour force and the longer-term unemployment. Fully support that. Just one thing about the skills, it also relates to some of the work we've done in India, some research. It's not specifically on youth, but on whether youth, is it really the lack of skills, mismatch, etc. Because, we do find when we're looking in the manufacturing sector, there is a major issue about the demand for skills in particular segments. Their idea of a skilled worker is somebody who can do the job for less than 10,000 rupees. And then they say, oh, we can't find anyone with the right skills. I mean, this is paraphrasing the researchers in an anecdotal way, but this is what we found, that it's not only just, if you can, there is a market for skilled workers in this country, and if you're willing to pay for it, you can get them. There are some very well-trained, of course, young people in this country. But at the same time, I don't want to belittle the issue of undereducation. I think undereducation is a massive problem. So it's not just that they don't have the skills that employers want, they're just suffering from an overall level of undereducation. Of course, Arup will talk about the situation in India. We've also looked at this in some other research on female labour force participation. And you'll find this in all countries. Education pays in terms of better jobs, even in developing countries with segmented labour markets and issues of skills mismatch, etc. Having a tertiary education means you have a much higher probability of finding a regular job in the formal economy. So, I would say, on one hand, it's an issue about the demand side, the affordability issues, the firm strategies, and on the other hand, it's also an issue of lower education. So, Neil's covered it very well about the costs of unemployment, so I'll skip that. I mean, I think the scarring effect is, of course, a very compelling argument for policymakers, that you have long-term impact of unemployment. Of course, we don't have such great evidence for developing countries, but you have evidence in OECD countries of 15 years of impact on wages and probability of being unemployed. So I think that is a very compelling story for policymakers to be concerned about it. Of course, I'm from the ILO. I should put ILO figures up there. So this is the overall figures, and I'm not going to go over this too much. But really, as you all know, the big rise in unemployment amongst youth that we've been talking about at a global level has been driven by the crisis, but it's really confined to developed economies in Europe in particular. And that's the top red line for the unemployment rate. So But it's also interesting, if you look at the earlier period, there was actually a decline in the unemployment rate. And this was the, the golden years of the 2000s when the demand side really was synchronized around the world, when young people were benefiting. But in fact, unemployment has gone back to a bad situation, but it was actually in a bad situation also, a decade before that. But that's not my main point today, but just to alert you to that. Of course, South Asia, other parts of developing regions, unemployment rate hasn't moved a lot, over those period. Now, just coming to South Asia, we've heard about India being around 10%. It's slightly higher for women. Nepal, of course, a low-income country, and Bandita will correct me on all these figures. This is the labour force survey, but well below 5%. And clearly, it's not the major challenge in those countries. But it is a much bigger problem in Sri Lanka and the Maldives. And that is also due to issues on the supply side, but also preferences of young people in particular. There's an issue, you're familiar with this public sector queuing. So young people want to get educated in order to get a stable, protected job in the public sector. At the same time, the public sector has been downsized and hasn't been growing fast enough for those young people. So young people remain unemployed, waiting for those types of opportunities. And that's much higher amongst women who also, socially, it becomes also easier for them to remain unemployed. Maldives has also some chronic, challenges. I've been working there recently. It's very, you have an island with 300,000 people, or archipelago, rather. It's very, you've got such stubborn problems that, you think, well, you should be able to solve this. It's less than one part of Delhi. But nonetheless, they have a very entrenched problems because of the nature of the economy and also because of preferences amongst young people and their basic levels of discouragement. And in fact, the Maldives figures does include the discouragement. So now let me just come to how to respond. So I think this is very interesting to think, because when I came to India 3 years ago, I was speaking to some senior policymakers about how you see youth employment as a challenge. And they said, oh, no, we do everything for youth. Everything we do is for youth. India is a young country. 2/3 of the population are under 35. So we don't need youth policies. We don't need youth strategies. This is a question to ask. Because what can we learn from other countries and the EU and OECD countries in particular? I mean, critically, macro side, demand side, the nature of growth, the sectoral distribution of growth and jobs is critical. And our jobs being created in the sectors and in the places where young people are and want to work. So I think it's very important. Prevention, about education. I think education is fundamental. Prevention, of course. I think it's also OECD made this point. ILO has been, of course, in the crisis that education pays. One then can look at the quality. Has to look at the quality of education and its relevance for the labour market. Yes, but there's no shortcuts. You have bad education. Don't expect to fix it with an active labour market policy. That is also the evidence. The dropout use are some of the hardest to help. But on these active labour market policies, I think, Neil's already gone over some of that evidence. I won't repeat it. But I think, on one hand, this is a very sort of OECD approach, but at the same time, all countries are doing that, also in this region. Countries, including India, is going through a process of revamping. You heard from Madam Secretary, Gauri Kumar, about what they're doing, career services. So they're transforming the current employment exchanges into these national career services. Other countries in the region are doing exactly the same thing. So is this going to be is this the most effective way that for these countries to improve job search amongst young people? Yes, let me finish. This is my last slide. Training, again, a lot of emphasis on skills development and training in the region. We have, of course, much less evidence, so clearly stress the need for impact evaluation. We need more and more impact evaluation in order to have an answer of that in a better way. So let me just say, okay, there are also approaches around the world which are useful, not just from OECD, but from Latin America, the Jóvenes program, which was a comprehensive approach, just alerting you to it, because in terms of evaluations, that comes out as finding that these programs have been successful through a comprehensive approach. Comprehensive is mentioned a number of times. That's the overall finding. It's much more important to intervene in terms of training, work experience, job and search assistance in a comprehensive way. So now I'll hand it over to my colleague, Professor Mitra, to look at the Indian side. Thank you.
Dr. Varick has given an overall perspective. I'll move on to the Indian evidence. Let me begin by saying that both youth employment and unemployment are challenges. With poor human capital formation, youth mostly land up in low productivity informal sector activities and remain in persistent poverty. On the other hand, those who are educated and are not able to get an employment of a desirable quality may participate in activities which tend to destabilize the social and economic functioning of the system. I have presented here the labor force participation rates for rural males, females, and urban males, females for various age groups like 15 to 19, 20 to 24, 25, 29, both from 2009-10 and 11-12 surveys. As you know, both these surveys threw up very different estimates. I'm not going to talk about the reasons why the differences in estimates exist. Rather, I would try to give you the long-term trend in the labor force participation rate in comparison to what we had perceived in the 90s and in 2004-05. With age, we tend to see that the labor force participation rate increases substantially. In fact, in some of the lower age brackets like 15 to 19, it's almost as low as that of the all-age participation rate. But in 25 to 29 and 19 to 24, it is substantially higher. Nevertheless, youth participation rate is higher than the non-youth, and this tends to suggest that while the social conditions in general tend to suppress the female labor force participation rate, in relative sense, young women are increasingly in search of jobs. Like in the previous slide, we saw that in the case of women, the labor force participation rates are much lower than their male counterparts, but nevertheless, there is difference between the youth and the non-youth participation rates. When we look at the various social categories, the scheduled tribe registered a higher participation rate than the scheduled caste. Scheduled caste participation rates are higher than the OBCs, and the general category recorded the lowest participation rate. Now, if we look at the workforce participation rate, again, it by and large follows the labor force participation rate trends. Among the rural females in all the three age groups, the principal and subsidiary status work participation rates dropped in 2009-10, or if you take 2011-12, compared to the long-term trend perceived since 93-94. Among the rural males also the same pattern is observed. In the urban areas, a similar pattern is observed, both among the males and females, with an exception of the age group 25 to 29 among the females in 2011-12, where you get to see a slight increase. Given the patriarchal system, the male workforce participation rate is unlikely to perceive any major decline in the prime age group of 25 to 29. Even when productive employment opportunities are not available, males cannot afford to withdraw from the labor market. Rather, they get residually absorbed in a wide range of low productivity activities. On the other hand, non-availability of productive employment opportunities for long may lead to the phenomenon of discouraged dropouts among women. And that could be one of the reasons why we get to see that there has been tremendous decline in the workforce participation rate in the case of women. This is sort of the pattern that workforce participation rate follows. Now, one may argue that increased participation in education could be a major reason of decline in the work participation rate in the age groups of 15 to 19 or 19 to 24. But in the rural context, I don't think this argument can really be extended. It is unbelievable that tertiary level education was pursued so widely that it led to a major decline in the work participation rate. Rather, we would argue that there has been a decline in employment opportunities. In the urban areas as well, the work participation rates decline, both among the males and the females in the age groups of 15 to 19 and 20 to 24, particularly in comparison to 2004-05. The fall continues even in the higher age bracket. Among urban, and in this age bracket, it is difficult to sustain the argument that they were participating increasingly in the tertiary level education. Among urban males, it is by and large stable in this age bracket. The explanation relating to education is rather difficult to justify. And since there is no evidence of a decline in the age at marriage between 2004, 5 and 9, 10, the fall in the workforce participation rate of women is rather a surprise. Many micro-studies have argued that many single women have migrated to the urban areas in search of a livelihood. So in that case, it should have raised the workforce participation rate. But since that has not happened, the demand side factors seem to have played a crucial role, indicating sluggish employment generation in the process of growth. Now, relating to education and workforce participation rate, there is a clear-cut decline, of course. Compared to the illiterates, the workforce participation rate tends to decline among those who have acquired primary level education or higher secondary level of education. But when we go to the higher level of education, like graduation, etc., there I think the labor force participation rate again, workforce participation rate again tends to rise. Coming to the nature of employment, mostly women are in the rural areas are in self-employment, and rural males are in casual wage jobs. In the urban context, I think it is again, women are mostly in self-employment, and urban youth are in wage jobs. Sometimes it is casual and sometimes it is regular wage jobs. Among the urban males, an early dropout from the education means pursuing relatively more of casual wage employment. On the other hand, among the urban females, an early dropout from education means more of self-employment, and those who complete higher levels of education tend to get regular wage employment. Now, in terms of sector of employment, women in the rural areas are mostly engaged in the primary activities, and the males in the rural areas are in non-farm activities. The males and females in the urban areas are mostly in the services, and this is low productivity services, not necessarily the high productivity services. Women are engaged relatively more in the agriculture, as I mentioned, and when it comes to the non-farm sector activities, we can actually talk about two important forces, the demand-induced activities and the supply-push phenomenon. And some of the micro-studies have suggested that the rural males are mostly engaged in low-productivity, supply-push, non-farm sector activities. As regards the unemployment rate, as the other studies have also pointed out, the youth unemployment rate is substantially higher than the overall unemployment rate, both in 2009, 10 and 11, 12. Now, this is the pattern which it follows. At higher age groups, it tends to decline. But what is more interesting to note is that possibly the skill levels of those who join the labor market are on the low side, and thus it becomes difficult for them to find a suitable employment, particularly in the early ages of their career when they lack adequate experience. In fact, in one of our studies, we found that there is increasing competition between the elderly workers and those who are about to join the labor market. And as a result, the youth is reducing their reservation wage to compete with the elderly workers. And that has sort of led to this low productivity employment to a significant extent. Now, in terms of youth unemployment and education, again, the unemployment rate among the graduates seem to be very high, so which again indicates that employment of a desirable status is perhaps not available. Among the social categories, we find that the general category recorded the highest unemployment rate in the rural areas, though it is not so in the urban context. It is also interesting to note that in the rural areas, the differences in male-female youth unemployment rates are nominal among the scheduled castes, OBCs, and the general categories. Among the rural youth, women therefore seem to be working at least as intensively as the males once they participate in the labor market. On the other hand, in the urban areas, women can afford greater spells of unemployment, and then we have listed various social factors which would impinge on women work participation rate and unemployment rate both. Now, in the logistic regression model, we have tried to identify some of the important determinants of labor force participation rate. And the results tend to suggest that, yes, with age, the participation rate tends to increase. Females always recorded a lower participation rate compared to the males. Probability of participation declines with education compared to the illiterates. In the urban areas, of course, show a lower participation rate compared to the rural areas. And the scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, and OBCs recorded a higher participation rate than the general categories. So overall, we get to see that many youth, because of poverty and poor human capital endowment, participate in the labor market at an early age. Among the early labor market entrants, males are usually in casual wage employment, while females tend to be in self-employment. Rural women are mostly engaged in the agriculture sector. Rural males are in non-agriculture. But as I mentioned, it is basically a supply push phenomenon. How many non-farm jobs are demand-induced is an important issue. Urban areas have reported that they are mostly engaged in the services sector. Educated youth, for the educated youth, the problem of unemployment is very serious, which has serious repercussions in terms of social instability. So challenges are more, opportunities have to be created to make the transition smooth from school to work. Better quality education, on-the-job training, and skill formation are essential. At the same time, the credit assistance and marketing assistance for those who are in self-employment are important. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both presenters. I think that was a very complimentary presentation, putting the issues of youth unemployment and employment in India in the context of the Asian economies more generally. I think what's a really fascinating question just for the current challenges facing India and also for the future is to what extent this decline in participation rates for women is structural, and what are the factors lying behind that, and what needs to be done to tackle that. Is this just a phase of development as there's a shift out of the urban areas, out of the rural areas into the urban areas? We saw this occur in Turkey. There was a decline in participation rates for women, but that's now rebounded over the last few years. Will we observe some rebound in participation rates for women? I think that's a really key question going forward. Thank you very much. Now let me turn to our discussant, who has the tremendous challenge within 15 minutes of trying to at least discuss that range of very rich presentations that were given. So please, Professor Arup Mitra, the floor. Please, Professor Alak Sharma, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. I had not got the opportunity to go through the papers. I had seen the small summaries of the papers, but the presentations here were very fascinating, very rich, and whatever my brief comments are here, largely based on the presentations and my own understanding of the subject. The two presentations by Professor Simid and Professor Higgins has touched largely European countries, European Union, of course in global context, and of course Chairperson also, he gave a global picture and South Asian scenario. Arup Mitra gave the picture of largely India, what has happened. I will try to, very briefly in 15 minutes that I have, the similarities between the European and Indian situation, and in the end I would like to point out the most important challenges that India faces in terms of youth employment, because we can learn from Europe, but there are also significant differences between developed countries and a developing country like India. In fact, this distinction in labor market has not been understood properly. That is why many people tend to just prescribe the solutions which are there in the developed countries. But many solutions, of course, are very valid also. I think, first of all, everybody pointed out that developing country as a whole, and South Asian countries in particular, and India, of course, except Sri Lanka and Maldives, have much lower youth unemployment rate, overall unemployment rate also, compared to European countries or compared to developed countries. And this is hardly a surprise, given the poverty, where poor people can't afford to be unemployed. This happens. And it is also well reflected in the fact that almost half of the employment in India is self-employment. What one of the speakers, Professor Higgins probably, said that it is a precarious employment. In fact, youth also, and when I say youth in India, generally it is defined as age group 15 to 29. In most of the states, in central government also, the cutoff age for getting employment is 29, 30. So generally it is not 24, it is generally 30. In rural areas, people get to higher education system after a longer gap and all that. That is why this has been kept. So overall, this is youth unemployment quite low. But what is happening in India is that there is need of seeing overall youth labor market and educated youth labor market separately. When you separate the two, the rate of unemployment of youth, educated youth, increases sharply. In fact, the rate of youth unemployment among educated is roughly 50 times higher than general level. And in case of females in India, of course, most of the speakers, Serverik and Arup also pointed out, it is also in case of females 50% higher than males. This is, of course, even then, it is much lower than Europe. But Europe, it will be close to 17, 18 or 20%. In India, educated youth unemployment will be around 11, 12%. In case of females, it is 17, 18%. So it is closer to Europe becomes. In fact, now unemployment in India is becoming more and more among educated people. Just to give you example, 30% of all unemployed in India are graduates and above. And this proportion was, till 5 years back, only 21%. So with time, as education is expanding, and this points out towards a major employment challenge that India is facing of educated unemployment. So probably, given the nature of labor markets, it will be better to talk about the segmented to labor markets. Because in India, all the poor backward states have lowest unemployment rate compared to richer unemployment rates. And it is in most of the developing countries. So this distinction, I think, must be kept in mind while comparing Europe and India. It was also pointed out by the two previous speakers, Professor Smith and Professor Higgins probably, about the youth who are not in employment, nor in education, nor training. It is I don't think what term we should give it, maybe inactive youth. In Europe, probably, this proportion this is a daunting problem. In India, of course, proportion rises compared to youth unemployment. But it is largely confined to women, because among males, it is only 2% youth, between 15 and 29 years of age who are not trying to get jobs. But in females, this goes to 20%. They are neither in educational system nor in labor market. So even they are just confined to domestic works or whatever works they are not doing. So it is largely a female-centric problem one has to keep in mind. One observation was, probably I'm forgetting, probably you said, that higher education system in India, when comparing Europe, lessons for India, it was pointed out that higher education system in India is some kind of a luxury. This is a very, I'm not saying that is a wrong statement, but one has to keep in mind, India is one of those countries in the world, among even developing countries, where enrollment in higher education is one of the lowest. Only 13–14% of people, of youth, are enrolled in higher education. And mind it, a large number of them are in general stream of education. 70% of all youth enrolled in higher education are science, commerce, not in professional or technical education. And many of them are just because they don't find jobs anywhere else, and higher education system, public education, oh, only 3 minutes. I think, so give me 5 minutes because anyway, so I think this is luxury. Let me, one aspect which has not been touched by, particularly by Europe, is the, and which is I consider very pertinent, is the regional dimensions of labor market and youth unemployment in India. And particularly, these regional differences in India are so large, like just to give you example, rural wages in Kerala will be something like 4 times higher than Chhattisgarh. 40% of the organized industrial employment concentrated in Gujarat, Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, these 4 states, which constitute only 20% of the population. So similarly, I can go on. These states, and mind it, in some states, the backward states, youth educated female employment is extremely high, rather alarming. To Bihar, 55% of the educated females, above graduates and above, there are not many, but most of them are unemployed because there are no jobs. So what Mr. Chair, you were saying, the irony is that women labor force participation is declining, has declined, but mind it, at higher level of education, it is not declining. The demand is more. And that is why unemployment among educated women, particularly in some states, is quite large. I think I will take 2 minutes. I think from all these presentations and what my observation, I think we have, I'm not going to, whatever speaker said about lessons from Europe or global labor, they are quite true. But the big picture emerges is that India, as I said, Indian youth unemployment is largely becoming educated one. And mind it, now almost every year we are adding 10 million young people to our labor force. They are not going to seek jobs in agriculture. For the first time in India, between 2005 and 2012, there has been absolute decline in agricultural employment. So those people are not going to find jobs in agriculture, National Rural Employment Guarantee Program. For the first time, all children are in school, including girls. So mind it that after 7-8 years, when all those people who will, they may not pass all of them high school, but maybe even if 50% of them pass it, the challenge of unemployment will be simply very, very huge. And the participation rate that women have witnessed is, Mr. Chair, you had pointed out, is, of course, it generally is thought that it is because of 3 reasons. One is higher enrollment rate among in the educational institutions. The other is, of course, social norms and all that. The other is lack of creation of appropriate employment for females. And due to supply side bottlenecks, particularly in a small towns, rural areas, as I said that backward states, female unemployment educated is very high because female can't migrate and all that. So all this. The other is, and now we stop. With this, associated problem is going to be rising migration and urbanization in India. In the last census, more people were born in urban areas in the entire Indian history compared to rural areas. And now this situation will continue. Migration will continue. So planning for migration, planning for educated employment, and planning for stable and better quality jobs, this is the most important challenge, apart from skill training, entrepreneurship, these are small side micro measures that will always remain. And India has to learn from Europe, better governance and all that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Sharma. I thought we really had a nicely balanced discussion here from our presenters, so I would like to thank them very much. I think that the last speaker really pointed out that the challenges facing India are sort of even larger than I was perhaps imagining at the beginning of this session. And I think some important points came out, which is, in fact, there are multiple labor markets for young people in India. It really there's a regional dimension to that, there is an education dimension to that, and there's a very strong gender dimension. I think that just points out that youth is certainly a very heterogeneous group, and you can't look at just one policy solution. You need to look at appropriate solutions for different groups. And then the challenge going forward will be to take advantage of a more educated, younger population in India, and to sort of ensure that there are those jobs for those groups. They will automatically create their own jobs, but I think there is a role for policy more generally to help employers start working with more highly educated younger people that will be knocking on their doors. So let me stop there, and we still have a few minutes for some questions. What I would like to do is take 2 or 3 questions and then ask the panelists to reply to that, and we will see how much time we have for subsequent rounds of questions. So let me turn over to the participants. Does anybody have any questions? One question back there. And please give your name and organization. Thank you.
I'm Professor Ravi Prakash, Dean and Professor, Faculty of Commerce and Management, Rama University, Kanpur. I was going through the entire discussion about the comparative analysis between the European status of unemployment among youth and in India. I was agreed with Professor Sharma that the condition of Europe and particularly the South Asia is entirely different. The problem with the female unemployment is a very, very higher side. As a dean and as the registrar of the university, I come across many a times while conducting interviews there are the various other problems. Whether they are getting sufficient time to be the part of the job market, or there is just some social restrictions. We have to analyze on those lines that what is the reason of the lower rate employment among educated female in India. My wife is from Bihar. She is educated. She is being offered several times jobs by the various institutions, but very difficult to get a job. How to tackle such problems? Whether we will rate under unemployability among female in India, or this problem is a particular. So I want to ask that how we will handle such problems in our country. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that pertinent question. Please follow the example of that first person and keep your questions very short. Thank you. Over there.
Piotr Lewandowski, IBS, Warsaw, Poland. I totally agree that kind of comparing the European experience of youth unemployment and the South Asia experience of youth labor market, these are extremely different cases. And as I know much more about Europe, I will talk more about Europe. And I would like to give a pinch of salt to this kind of positive view of the dual system, because this graph that Professor Ginter Schmidt showed with the youth labor market indicators for the dual countries, let's say dual education system countries, I mean that graph was very nice, but I'm just a little bit afraid that you could replace the name dual education system countries with just Germany plus Austria, and then we can argue that if you have countries which have a very strong manufacturing, big public sector employment, and high overall employment rates, then they fare really well in terms of youth unemployment and youth employment. And it is not accidental that basically the other European countries haven't adopted the dual system yet. If it is so great, so wonderful, so why haven't all countries around the region follow suit? That's one of the reasons I think is that the dual system to work needs a specific economic structure. And just to give you the example, the share of people with vocational education, so people who are aged around 18, 19, which they finish education, which work in Germany in companies with at least 250 workers, is 33%. And even in countries like Poland, which is a middle-income country, there are simply not so many big employers who are able to invest in cooperating with vocational education system to provide all this investment and it's going to be the same in many other countries where the economic structure in manufacturing is much more dispersed, I would say. On the other hand, another comment, if you look at where the people who are graduating from the vocational system in Germany work, many of them work in public services as well, health, for example. So again, for less developed countries, it's not that easy to translate that system, because you need a huge manufacturing and a huge public sector to invest in these trainings, which is very tough to do in a country which is dominated by companies which employ 2, 5, or 9 workers, and simple as that.
Thank you very much. One last question, and then we'll turn it back to the presenters over there.
Hello, I'm Gauri. I'm the assistant editor of Financial Chronicle. It's a newspaper. So I have like a couple of questions, and the first one would be directed to analysts who are dealing more or less with the Indian scenario, because I have a question related to caste specifically, because to analyze European countries vis-a-vis India makes a lot of sense to me, but it also makes sense to look at the question of caste vis-a-vis the question of class. We are looking at a lot of urban versus rural data, and I was wondering about the data that deals with the question of caste and the role it plays in predetermining profession in India, because caste is, usually historically it has been profession based, and that's where it evolved from. And this history is still continuing in a certain way where, the son of a farmer is usually expected to become a farmer, and it goes on and on. So the youth, I think, has a little bit of a problem when they're trying to, shift jobs from one sector to another sector, or when they're migrating from rural to urban areas. So I think it's also related to the problem of migration from rural and urban areas. So that's the first question. And the second is kind of more or less an observation. It's interesting for me and slightly amusing to have a panel of all male analysts speculating on the biases, the gender biases, and the female workforce, etc. So I want to have, my question is to the analysts, in their own fields, what is the difference between pedagogy and practice? I mean, what do you feel in your own fields it is required to have a couple of female analysts sitting there and talking about this issue? That's it.
Well, let me turn back to the panelists, and I think they should start with the gender question. I should apologize on behalf of everybody here, because I think that question should be addressed to the organizers, as we weren't asked our gender before we accepted this, yes. So let me turn back to the panelists. Who would like to start? Perhaps on the last question, then we can work backwards.
Yes, you're absolutely right. That there is a difference in terms of caste and participation rates. Across various categories, we tend to see that participation rate tends to vary. As I mentioned to you, that workforce participation rate among the scheduled tribes is usually on the high side, and among the general category it is lower. And again, male-female differences across various caste categories is also very different. Similarly, the levels of education and the unemployment rates also tend to vary across caste categories. Now, it will be interesting to do an in-depth analysis that whether they are able to shift to other better occupations away from the traditional ones which they were pursuing. Now, whatever little research we have done in this paper, it tends to suggest that it is very difficult for the women to shift from the agriculture to the non-agricultural activities. For males, it has been relatively easier. However, the activities in the non-farm sector are not of demand-induced type. It is the supply-push type activities in which they are mostly engaged in. In the urban areas, of course, irrespective of caste, they have been able to shift to the services sector. I don't say that they are not at all present in the manufacturing sector. To some extent they are, of course, and the regional variations are also of great significance, as Dr. Sharma has pointed out, which I should have brought out in my presentation. But in the services sector, again, we get to see that the low caste women are mostly engaged in petty activities compared to the males. Males are also engaged in low productivity activities, but slightly better than what their women counterparts are.
Thank you very much. And I'll ask Gunther to reply about the question on dual apprenticeship systems and how applicable they are to other countries.
Of course, this is a crucial question. The first answer is a more general one. I talked about the dual system not only in terms of apprenticeship system at the middle level. I defined dual systems as a combination of work and training, and a combination of work, training and earning, which is very important for young people, because young people would like to have a subsistence level and to be in a way free of the from the parents to earn some money. Even already during the education is an important value for, especially for young adults. And this is provided by dual systems, and more and more of the dual system character is translated in Germany, at least, not only in Germany, but also in Switzerland, in Austria, in the Netherlands, and in some other countries with low youth unemployment at the level of, at the academic level. There are vocational academies in Germany where young people have a high school diploma and have graduated for the universities, but they start in firms, get a contract with a firm, and a kind of a higher apprenticeship system. At the same time, they go in block courses 3 or 4 weeks or sometimes some months, go to the university and get the theoretical training. This is a combination of dual systems, not only at the middle level, but also at the higher level. And if you look in Germany on the development of the education system at the tertiary level and university academic level, you find more and more an expansion in terms of colleges, vocational colleges, in which, for instance, what we call, hard to translate, it's a kind of vocational academy, where the teachers already have to have the obligations that they have to have experience in the business. So they come not just up from school, from a formal school level, but the requirement for good teachers is to have served somewhere in the public services or in a firm or in the IT technology or somewhere else. And more of these high college schools get also teachers from the firms to get knowledge what are the real skill needs of the firms. And this is the first general answer. Second, I think even in India, where you do not have the infrastructure, Neil mentioned the institutional precondition for dual system apprenticeship systems, which are very, very high. And you cannot build it up from the beginning. But I recently came across about an experimental project in New Delhi even, in the slums of New Delhi, where young women have been trained for 9 months in a dual system. It was an experimental project which provided the women for stitching and for tailoring the machines, the necessary machines. So that means, in addition, they provided some kind of child care that they could go to the training, and some more preconditions. And this project, this experimental pilot project, was extremely successful in terms of final higher education, final higher employment, higher wages, and things like that. So even you can start at a very low level with the dual apprenticeship systems. And in addition, you have to keep in mind that about 20% of the so-called dual system in Germany is full-time vocational school system, but oriented toward a broad field of occupations and things like that. And the most important thing is also in terms of motivation, that you provide at the same time the ability, the opportunity for these people at a later stage, when they are not satisfied with their vocational training or the occupation, that they at a later stage, let's say with the age of 25, 30 or 35, have the opportunity to go back to the tertiary universities. You have to, at the same time, to open the formal system of higher education as a possible aspiration for these people. Mobility opportunities, then you increase the motivation for the dual training system. As to my knowledge and from learning from Korea, I know a little bit, very much about South Korea, it's also a tremendous issue of motivation. The status of apprenticeship is very, very low. In Korea, for instance, I assume it's also very, very low in India. So we have to establish some kind of a long-term perspective of the possibilities of upward mobility. And final point is, of course, job creation. Job creation is the important issue. Aggregate demand. Everybody was telling this. So you have to have a huge investment in public services, in education, care services, medical services, and so on. And these are potential, especially potential jobs for women, for high qualified women. So without job creation, you cannot establish a dual training system in the wider sense.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. At the risk of eating into your sort of coffee break, can we have a last couple of questions? Very briefly, please. Keep them very brief. So, one here.
Thank you. My name's Barbara Harris-White. I'm from Oxford. Why are there so few women in the labour force, and why since 2005 have many women left the labour force? I have a colleague, Judith Heyer, who has been looking at 3 villages in Coimbatore district since 1980. And she's been looking particularly at Dalit women who work at it with terrible drudgery in the fields. And what she finds is that when the real wages of their male household wage earners increase, which they have been doing, the women voluntarily leave agricultural labour. It's not that they're forced to leave, they want to leave, they wish to stay at home, they wish to improve the quality of childcare, because women in the age group of youth are almost always mothers, mothers of small children, multiple small children. So unless you improve the quality of agricultural labour, you are not going to improve women's participation in that part of rural South India. The second observation I want to make very quickly comes from fieldwork that I've been doing over the last 2 years on innovation in the informal economy of a small town. What we find is that educated young people do, in fact, object to the kind of work for Nokia. They prefer to commute to industrial corridors and do work which may be much less interesting. And in turn, the patriarch no longer has a son that they can trust for price negotiation, for credit relations, so it has a huge impact on retail sales in the town. They have to employ wage work for the same work and less of it. I foresee a crisis in the bazaar of the family firm because of the education of boys.